Well, welcome back to Breaking the News Plus. It has been a minute. We've been on Olympic break and had some high school sports to bring to you. But today we bring back a frequent guest, our investigative reporter Lou Raguse, to talk about what he covered today, because it's extremely interesting if you're into the legalese of Minnesota courts. Welcome back, Lou.
Thank you. Thanks. This is a case I've been waiting for, by the way.
Okay, well then that makes it good in terms of what we want to dig into. A serious case. This is the murder conviction of Nick Firkus. He's convicted in 2023 of killing his wife Heidi Firkus 13 years prior in St. Paul.
Yes.
A jury in 2023 says he's guilty.
Yes.
So what happened today?
Okay, so today the state Supreme Court affirmed the conviction, which means they agreed with the jury verdict, and Nick Firkus will stay in prison for the rest of his life. He was convicted of first-degree murder, which is an automatic life sentence, and so this eliminates the possibility of him being released, and it affirms that he indeed was guilty. But that's a big, because this was a big case, and it was a cold case, and we covered it very extensively, and I covered the trial. So it's a big ruling just on the fact of that it's a high-profile case. But the ruling itself was something that lawyers across the state have been waiting for, because it really digs into cases that are like this one that rely on a lot of circumstantial evidence.
And that's part of the reason that you had been waiting for this day to see what the state Supreme Court would say. It is in this very legalese part of what the Supreme Court would decide about circumstantial evidence. So what did it decide in this case?
Well, in Minnesota is one of a few states that has a more strict review after a conviction for cases that mostly rely on circumstantial evidence. And
for our folks, circumstantial evidence is?
Okay, circumstantial evidence is something that, for example, you could testify about something that you saw, and that would be direct evidence. If it's talking about something that you infer, that would be circumstantial. And they always use the example like if you go to bed at night and there's no snow on the ground, but you wake up in the morning and there is snow on the ground, you can infer that it snowed last night,
Gotcha.
Even though you didn't witness the snow falling.
Okay.
Now, there could be the remote possibility that someone came and dumped a whole bunch of snow, and then your inference would be incorrect.
Okay.
And that's why circumstantial evidence in Minnesota and a couple other states, they've decided to have this little more stringent review after the fact when a case is being appealed.
And a first-degree murder case you were sharing with me is almost always circumstantial.
Yeah,
evidence.
unless the killer or accused killer admitted to somebody else what he did or wrote it down, or there's some sort of way to get direct evidence that he committed the crime. A lot of times, a first degree, which is premeditated murder, that premeditation is proven with circumstances. Okay, for example, if he took out a life insurance policy a couple days before the crime, that would be, okay, he was planning this.
Okay.
Like it doesn't directly prove it, but it's an inference that you can use to prove the premeditation.
So in 2023, a jury ruled that Nick Firkus was guilty of first-degree murder
Yes.
of his wife Heidi.
Yes.
With circumstantial evidence. They
Yes.
had enough evidence presented to them that they said A plus B plus C equals we think he did it.
Yeah, and I'll give you a quick review of that. And it was not a tough decision for this jury. It was a pretty quick verdict. But Nick Firkus claimed that there was an intruder and that he had his shotgun in his hand. He had woken up his wife, Heidi, and she called 911. He told her there was an intruder, so she called 911 saying somebody's trying to break into our house. They went down the stairs together, and Nick Firkus claims that someone at that precise moment barged in the door, grabbed the gun, and while they were struggling, the gun went off and shot his wife, Heidi.
Okay,
that's his story. But during the trial, there was a lot of circumstantial evidence, such as there was a coffee table right next to that door with a bunch of items, a rickety, shaky coffee table that when police got there, they accidentally were knocking stuff down from it. But there was nothing disturbed on it from this so-called struggle that happened. There were other things, such as they were about to get kicked out of their house the very next day, foreclosed on, and actually evicted by the sheriff. But it seemed that Heidi had no idea that she was inviting people over to play games the following weekend when they no longer would be living there.
Okay.
And so there were all these circumstances that showed that it was a premeditated and planned murder by Nick Firkus, but not that direct evidence. So that's what made it a circumstantial case. So the jury had no problem with it, but the state Supreme Court did. It took them almost 2 years to reach this decision. And the appeals courts have been putting a bunch of other cases on pause when they get to the appeal because they're appealing kind of the same issue, and they're waiting for this state Supreme Court ruling on it.
Okay.
And so now to the ruling.
Yes.
So as I said, they decided to keep Nick Firkus in prison. They affirmed that, but they kind of narrowed, my legal analyst would describe, the way that this circumstantial evidence review process is done. They made it a little clearer on how it should be done. And what it does is it gives more weight to the way that the jury interpreted the evidence through their verdict.
Because conceivably, the Supreme Court could have said, because they have this other factor, like, okay, the jury found him guilty using circumstantial evidence, but we have this other kind of burden here that was every other thing considered. So they could have said, well, we don't think every other thing was considered, and kicked Nick Firkus free?
Yes, exactly. And the way that they phrase it is that there's no other reasonable hypothesis, okay? And so the Chief Justice, Natalie Hudson, dissented, and she thought that it should be overturned. And her rationale was that it is a reasonable hypothesis that there was an intruder.
That's all?
So she felt that there wasn't enough ruling that out. And therefore, even though he was found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt by a jury, that under this circumstantial evidence review, that the case should be overturned. And in a case like this one, there'd be no way to retry it because there's not like any new evidence to use. The case, it is what it is. And so he would have been freed.
Well, that didn't happen, and that's because there are other justices that went for this other interpretation.
Yes.
Can you talk about, in layman's term, what that is?
And so using the Firkus example, because that's the one at hand here, it was a hypothesis that there was an intruder. And it came out in the trial because he did an interview with police, an interrogation that was videotaped, and that was shown to the jury. And so the majority of the justices here ruled that the jury rejected that hypothesis because they didn't believe it. They found him guilty. If they believed his rationale, he would have been not guilty. So this hypothesis was disproven in court in the course by the jury's verdict.
The jury eliminated the hypothesis that he presented to them.
Exactly right. And so that's what the justices in the majority of this opinion say, is that we can't consider that anymore because the jury has we have to give weight to what the jury thought about it because they're the ones that are evaluating the truthfulness of demeanor and stuff like that. When the justices look at it, they're reading it on paper, they're reading transcripts and stuff like that. So they use the phrase that we can't act as a 13th juror. We have to accept what the jury decided concerning certain pieces of evidence.
So based on this decision today that gives the jury verdict, in this case, a little bit more heft, more weight, more consideration, does it affect those cases that you said some are kind of laying and waiting?
Absolutely.
How so?
Well, the way that they will look at circumstantial evidence is affected because, like I mentioned, the way that the jury saw things is going to be considered a little more clearly. They have to look at the totality of it and not just each individual circumstance. That was part of the ruling today. And there's another thing, and this is getting a little more into the weeds, but it affects a case that we've talked about already, which is the local judge in Hennepin County that threw out a fraud case based on, she used this circumstantial review of the case. Well, what the Supreme Court ruled here is that it would be premature for the district court judge, during the trial to use this review. They would have to use the broader review, which is, you could call it a direct evidence review, but it's like a broader review where you look at the evidence in the most favorable light to the prosecution. And that's where, as soon as the prosecution's done with their case, the defense raises their hand and say, we ask for a motion for acquittal.
Right.
And then the judge denies it.
Right.
Almost always. Yeah. But so in that fraud case, for example, the judge, she basically said, I'm going to take my time on your motion here. I'm not going to rule right now. And in the interim, the jury came back with a guilty verdict. So she did the circumstantial evidence review and then basically tossed out the jury verdict because she thought that there was a reasonable hypothesis in this fraud case that the man convicted did not know that there was fraud going on in his company. And so that was her rationale for tossing it out. Under this new ruling, according to my legal analysts that took a look at it, they say that that would be a premature thing for that judge to do.
Yeah, and maybe not just in that case. And I certainly don't have the legal acumen that you do or the folks that you talk to, but it seems to be leapfrogging a jury's decision.
Yeah.
And that feels, to the everyman, somewhat unfair.
Right. And under this circumstantial evidence standard, they can no longer do that.
There you go. We went to law school on our first day back to Breaking the News.
And I'm not a lawyer either, so if I got some of that wrong, I'm sure
He's not a lawyer.
I'm sure
he does
that
not.
our lawyers will let me know about it.
Lou Raguse, thank you for making it clear as mud yet again. We appreciate your time on this case and all the rest. Thanks for joining us back on Breaking the News Plus. We'll see you next time.